Well, hello, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started with our presentation tonight. So welcome to night 2 of the Center for French Colonial Studies annual conference via Zoom. I'm Will Thompson, the center's vice president and the coordinator of the virtual conference. We had a great talk and a great crowd to start things off last night, and I'm excited to hear what our next speakers have to say. I'll remind you that after tonight, we have 3 more speakers, one tomorrow, Randa Duvik, and 2 on Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock, Mark Walzinski and Carl Eckberg. So be sure to check our website, FrenchColonialStudies.org, for more information about their talks. Our format, as it was last night, is to have our speaker present for approximately 45 to 50 minutes. We welcome questions or comments at any time through the chat feature. That worked quite well last night, so we'll stick with that. I'll keep track of these and share them with our presenter at the end of the talk. So our speaker tonight is, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Peter Machonis. Peter is professor of French and linguistics at Florida International University and 3-time recipient of the FIU Excellence in Teaching Award. He's the author of 2 books on the history and evolution of the French language. He is currently focusing on the diversity of sociolinguistic situations where French is spoken outside of France. In 2019, he participated in an NEH summer seminar entitled Material Maps in the Digital Age at the Newberry Library, where he examined many early maps of New France and explored Chicago's French origins. His presentation tonight, which I believe is to a great extent based on his experience at the Newberry, is Early French Perspectives of the Lower Mississippi through Maps and Memoirs. So Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Will. Okay, I'd like to say a big thanks to Will, whom I actually met recently at the American Association Teachers of French conference this past summer, as well as a shout out to the Center for French Colonial Studies for the opportunity to expand and share my research. Actually, I met Randa Duvik also at the AATF as well. It goes to show that these online conferences are really great ways of meeting other researchers in French. In any event, my presentation, as Will mentioned, stems from a NEH seminar in the Newberry Library entitled Material Maps in the Digital Age. The Newberry Library is an independent research library with a focus on the humanities and is privately funded but free and open to the public. One of its many strengths is to support research, include a core collection focusing on maps, travel, and exploration. The seminar focused on critically reading original maps and applying the practice to teaching with authentic documents, often in digital form. But my focus was examining, as Will had mentioned, early maps of New France, namely Quebec, Louisiana, Mississippi, and New Orleans. I've also used resources from the McLean collection, also in Chicago, as well as the Library of Congress online. At the seminar, I guess the main thing that I learned was that maps are more than just graphic interpretations of spatial information, but they actually highlight the history and culture of the period in which they were made. In fact, there was a paradigm shift in cartographic studies in the end of the 20th century. In a postmodernist effort to deconstruct maps, Harley, Edney, and other cartographers suggested that maps should not be viewed as a closed system, as factual, epistemologically unproblematic documents, but rather maps should be approached as an open system. All maps possess a deeper and perhaps hidden level of symbolism that communicates socially, culturally, and politically charged understanding of spatial significance. Maps can also add navigation, but can also persuade and assert power. As Harley states, if the history of cartography is to grow as an interdisciplinary subject among the humanities and social sciences, new ideas are essential. I initially focused on the early maps of Quebec and New France, to see to what extent Champlain and others used cartographic representations to market the New World. I'll briefly explain this project and then move on to more recent work involving the lower Mississippi, seen through the eyes and maps of early 18th century explorers Lepage du Prat and Dumont de Montigny. According to Christine Marie Petot, when France was king of cartography, during the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, Paris emerged as the leading world center for map production. Among the new cartographers was Champlain, who spent a majority of his life in New France, crossing the Atlantic over 20 times, mapping and writing about this new environment. He spent a year and a half in France writing about his travels in Les Voyages. And in a previous presentation, I argued that Champlain's maps served as a secondary purpose to generate interest in a place generally not known for its harsh climate, and as part of an overall plan to sell or market the New World to potential colonists. Champlain's Carte géographique de la Nouvelle-France portrays some of the earliest images of Native Americans, but not dressed for winter, downplaying the harsh winters, but all along with local fruits, vegetables, nuts, berries, a variety of fish, all available on the Great Bank. Champlain draws fur-bearing animals on the map as well. And this is also the first map to note a chain of Great Lakes, which Champlain had surely heard about from his Native American informants, along with Niagara Falls. Here's an overview of Champlain's Carte géographique de la Nouvelle-France. You have the topographical features here, but let's look at what's really on this map. Okay, on the lower right, left-hand corner, okay, you have the Native Americans, but not dressed for winter, downplaying the harsh winters, but dressed for war with a bow and arrow along with a shield. Although there is a Native American woman here on the right holding a squash and an ear of corn. And notice the vegetables and fruits at the bottom, as if Champlain wants to emphasize the abundance of food crops in the New World. He even details what's available in the fishing bank, naming the chien de mer, the dogfish, the molu, the cod, the sculpin or gros chabot, or the bar, the sea bass, all readily available in the immense fishing bank, with berries and nuts and even a little frog below. Okay, it's almost like he's inviting you to come to the New World. You also have the infamous castor, the beaver. On this slide, if you look closely, well, actually I've circled it, you have the rat musqué, the muskrat, as well as the sable, the martre. And all the way over the far left, this map highlights the abundance of local foods, fish and furs that Champlain used to entice French colonists. But this is also the first map to note a chain of Great Lakes. And here we have Niagara Falls, noted as Saut de Haut. Okay, we have the entire Lake Ontario and the beginning of Lake Erie on this map. But perhaps the most widely used sales tactic on maps of the time was the beaver vignette. First introduced by Nicolas de Fer in a 1698 map, it shows numerous beaver characters walking upright, carrying construction materials on their shoulders, each beaver with a task building dams in order to create a great lake at Niagara Falls. Nicolas de Fer's original beaver vignette, which is displayed on the map of the Newbury, was reproduced in mirror image. Basically, others copied it, but when they did that, the template was always in reverse and appeared on many subsequent maps of the time. The best version that I did find was at the McLean collection, and it's a colorized version by Herman Moll. Here we have the illustrated Nicolas de Fer, not the best shot, but here you have the beaver vignette on the upper left-hand corner. And then here is a close-up of that, okay? You can't beat the setting, Niagara Falls in the background, and you have all the busy beavers. You can see this better probably in Moll's. Okay, here's Moll's colorized version, okay? And also just notice that he's really emphasizing the English colonies on his map. And let's see, close up of this. Here, take a closer look. By the 18th century, the Eurasian beaver was nearly extinct after centuries of hunting them for castor oil and pelts. So a multitude of beavers, even the cartoonish beavers, seem to suggest instant and endless prosperity for those who dare go there. Okay. Similar to Champlain's map, Moll's cartoonish beaver map emphasizes an abundance of furs, along with a subliminal reading that if scores of industrious beavers can organize themselves and achieve success in the New World, so can you. Another aspect of my research at the Newberry involved maps and power. Cartographers say that all wars start on maps, but it was almost dramatic to see some of the differences between the French and British maps of the 1700s. At the end of the 17th century, France was comprised of Acadie, Canada, Louisiana, okay, 12,000 inhabitants, but New England was just a coastal band, but had 200,000 inhabitants. But that didn't stop the French from claiming land that was not theirs. Okay? A Parisian mapmaker, Guillaume de Lille, okay, and the official Géographe du Roi never traveled to the New World, but he drew up maps in Paris. His Carte de la Louisiane generated a boundary dispute that lasted 15 years, according to Petto. It seems to have lasted well into the mid-17th century, though. We will compare his map to two others from 1755. The Society of Anti-Gallicans, and then John Mitchell's map. De Lille's map put the border east of the Appalachians, all the way over to here. Okay, thus angering the English. Okay, he also extended French territorial claims to the Rio Grande, angering the Spanish as well. It was drawn up by de Lille, officially de l'Académie Royale des Sciences, thus giving an air of officiality and legitimacy to these unusual boundaries. But this map implies a vast French empire. Looking at this part closer, okay, notice that Carolina seems to be part of Louisiana. He further aggravated the English by claiming that Carolina was founded in 1562, was founded in, well, 1562, and named for the French King Charles IX of France, rather than 1670 by the English in honor of King Charles II of England. Here we read, Caroline, ainsi nommée en l'honneur de Charles IX par les Français qui la découvrirent, en prirent possession et s'y établirent l'an 1500. He wasn't even sure of the date. And then further down, notice that we read that Charlestown was named by the French as Chalfeur. Okay, Chalfeur is really down in northern Florida. The English try to take back their land in subsequent maps. Here we have the Anti-Gallican Society of Anti-Gallican maps. Okay, we read at the top of this map a new and accurate map of the English Empire in North America, representing their rightful claims as confirmed by charters and the former surrender of their Indian friends. Likewise, the encroachments of the French with the several forts they have unjustly erected therein. And this, of course, is by a Society of Anti-Gallican. We further read on this map that the French claim all the territory within the Hudson Bay Company's southern limits and the Brown Line. And the purple line represents the western boundary. Okay, so, but the boundary should be this purple line, represents the hereditary and conquered country of our Indian friends and allies, which has been ceded and confirmed to us by several treaties and deeds for sale. So they're trying to make the French claim from here over there. It's even more surprising on Mitchell's map. Okay, here it's often considered the most important map in American history. We notice the size of French territory is minimized and seems to suggest that Virginia, both Carolinas, and Georgia extend even beyond the Mississippi River. Mitchell, though, basically conceived of his map of North America in order to present the British public with a single large format image of all the colonies and to illustrate the extent of the French threat to British claims in North America. Likewise, even the Londoner Herman Mall's map, advertising the New World with its beaver vignette, which we had seen, also seems to emphasize British possessions. Thus, it can be argued that competing versions of North American maps were potentially motivated and helped instigate the 7 Years' War. While at the Newberry, while examining the air collection, 257, I ran across some drawings and maps made by Dumont de Montigny. Okay? And these were color maps and illustrations of the lower Mississippi. And since then, I have examined a new translation of his memoirs, done by Gordon Sayre and Carla Zecker, which was based on the 1747 French manuscript of the Newberry. Okay, it's an excellent translation and also includes some of the maps and drawings from the air collection. It's available from University of North Carolina Press as well as on JSTOR. During the summer of AETF meeting, I also discovered another French explorer, thanks to chat in Zoom, okay, Lepage Dupratz. We're not sure if he was born in the Netherlands or in France, but he was raised in France. And like Dumont, he published a Memoirs sur la Louisiana, albeit with fewer maps, but about his time in Louisiana. Both men lived in Louisiana in the early 1700s. They certainly knew each other and probably discussed the flora and fauna along with the history and geography of the region. There's a lot of similarity between the two works. Lepage started publishing his work as a series from 1751 to 1753. This probably pushed Dumont to actually publish his manuscript in 1753, and this was followed by Lepage's 3-volume collection in 1758. So in essence, they were competing for authority over the same material. When I'm reading one or the other, I sometimes forget who wrote what, and there's a lot of overlap. But let's look at these two explorers. Dumont was the son of a lawyer. He left for Louisiana in 1719 with a commission as a lieutenant after a year in Quebec. There was great interest in the colony due to the financial schemes of John Law and the Mississippi Company. Dumont was in charge of a unit of soldiers sent to develop the land grants or concessions, but Law's financial bubble collapsed in 1720. Investors basically stopped sending money to the New World when they realized that their investments were part of a pyramid scheme. Nevertheless, Dumont stayed on. He was assigned to various forts such as Natchez, farmed his lands, went on various expeditions. He also ran into trouble with his superiors, whose authority and honesty he often challenged. He was even imprisoned at times. He actually compared himself to a fictional French Robinson Crusoe. He stayed in Louisiana until he stayed in Louisiana until 1738. And I'll be quoting from Sayre and Zecker's 2012 translation from University of North Carolina Press, as well as using maps from the Newberry. Lepage Dupratz, on the other hand, was not a military officer, but went to Louisiana as a planter, purchasing a land grant or concession under the Mississippi bubbles. Okay. After the bubble collapsed, he moved to Natchez on a farm he had purchased from the Natchez from 1720 to 1728. Then moved to New Orleans to work as a manager or director of plantations for the Company of the Indies. He was very knowledgeable about the soil and climate, and like Dumont, left on expeditions further north, looking for mineral deposits. He returned to France in 1734. His writings also includes ethnographic descriptions and natural history tidbits. I'll be quoting from the Arthur edition, available from Google Books online, as well as the Old Carolina Press 2021 hard copy. The English translation is, the two differences is that Dumont de Montigny is a modern translation made by Serre and Zecker. The Lepage du Prat's will sound very stilted. It's basically a reproduction of the 1774 English translation, okay, with all of its original grammar and spellings. The only thing that changes, though, thank God, is that you don't deal with those long S's. Okay, so you just have typical S's in the spelling. Other than having fewer maps than Dumont, one difference is perhaps the amount of sympathy Lepage had for Native Americans, which he often referred to as les naturels, rather than les sauvages, as Dumont and other writers. Although there aren't too many maps from Lepage, there are some in the Library of Congress. Okay, and one of them we'll actually look at. Okay, here's the copy Les Naturels en été. Okay, and here you have a copy of the Memoirs of Lieutenant Dumont. Okay, let's start off south of New Orleans. The Watchas concession. This is the first major concession that we come across as we travel up the Mississippi, and that Dumont describes as follows. After 28 leagues, you see the Watchas, which is the finest of all concessions in the country. It belongs to Monseigneur le Duc et Maréchal de Belle-Île as partners. One might say that this concession is very rich, with more than 120 Negro men and women, a fine manor house, and outbuildings, storehouse, forge, workshop, indigo works, wharf, a fine courtyard, livestock, cabins for the laborers and the Negroes, and a manager to look after it all. In earlier times, this place was a village of Indians known as the name of Watchas, who in exchange for trade goods or loot abandoned this place and retired to a place further inland. If we look at the concession, here we've got a map of it. Okay. Notice the largest building is the fine manor house, the manager's house. There's a fair amount of terre défrichée, number 23, the cultivated lands. Okay, the slaves' quarter, number 14, is nearby over here. There's indigo works up here on the upper left, 13. Okay, there's even a wharf along the Fleuve Saint-Louis. Okay. And if we look at this part here in more detail, I'll zoom in on that. Okay, you have the manager's house, number 1, the Maison du Régisseur. You have a cuisine, number 2. You have a forge. You even have a house for the surgeon. You have a woodwork shop, number 6. You've got the Parc aux Bestiaux. You've got the stockyard over here, surrounded by another enclosure. You've got the number 8 is the poulailler, or the hen house. And you've got 9. You've got the poulailler. This is the colombier, or the dovecote. Okay, and over number 9 is the poulailler. If we look at some more, you've got the grange and barn, the grange, the barns over here. And you also notice that he mentions the 16, a pit, okay, before you actually have the levee, okay, the landing site, number 19. And then the contrast of 20 and 21 is rather surprising. You've got 20. He seems to have forgotten to put the number, but this is the only bell I could find on this. But that's the cloche pour appeler les nègres au travail, so a bell to call the slaves to work, which is also near a croix de mission, a mission the mission cross. And of course, 23, you have all the lands, cultivated lands nearby. So it's a very large concession. In his ethnography chapter, Dumont writes that he will explain to my reader the wealth and opportunities that might be had there. I shall now follow through and set down in writing some things about the province of Louisiana, the manners of the Indians, their religions, their dances, their customs. Then I shall describe the French settlements, what they do in that country, their trade, their explorations, in one word, the truth about everything. So he also discusses the Native Americans, how they acquired guns. For example, in earlier times, they only had bows and arrows for weapons. They were very skilled with these bows, but the men were equally so with guns, which nearly all of them own. The French and English having provided them in exchange for their trade goods such as poultry grain. It is also true in the hunt that they never miss when they fire an animal. Why? It is because patience is the very foundation of their hunting strategy. They approach their prey carrying the head of a deer with its skin and horns attached. This lightweight disguise they hold in front of them. And when the live animal looks at them, they move with all the manner of a deer. Here we have example of a sauvage à la chasse, okay, carrying the head of a deer with its skin and horn attached. These are some of the images that I'd run across at the Newberry in 2019, and I kind of left them to the side because I was very involved with selling the New World with Champlain. But here's a few more of them. Here we've got the Native American on the left with the bow and arrow. Again, notice they're calling them sauvage, in contrast to the Native American that's tattooed with his modern arm, with his new arms, with they say armes nouvelles, with his rifle. Okay. And in the middle, we have a Native American dancing with the peace pipe, the calumet, and the gourd in his hand. In this chapter, Dumont also gives details of the peace pipe ceremony, or the ceremonial calumet. The calumet, as it is carried and presented in ceremonies, is the symbol of peace among all these savage nations, and perhaps only the Natchez have ever violated it in the massacre that they committed on the French at that post, which we will hear about shortly. Here we've got some musical instruments. Okay. That kind of got my attention as well too. You've got the drum, which is just an earthen pot for a drum with just one stick for to beat on it. You've got number 4, you've got the empty gourds, you've got the clochette, a bell, and then you've got a grelot or little bell over here. Along with the ethnography, we also hear about how the Native Americans tortured their captives. Okay. The prisoners are led into the plaza in front of the temples, and if they are not to be kept as slaves, a council is assembled in the home of the chief, and there they are condemned to be burned. Their clothing is removed, leaving them as naked as your palm. They remain tied up during the entire ceremony. The square frame is set up in the plaza, and when this is ready, they go fetch the poor victims. They are untied from the post and made to run from one side of the plaza to the other, while periodic shots are fired at them. The guns charged with blank powder and nearly touching their bare flesh. This is how their victims provide them with amusement. When the mob tires of this, the prisoners are led to the frames and the movement where they are, to the frames, and the moment when they arrive. This is the last opportunity for a female chief to come spare one of their lives by offering a ransom in merchandise. When it appears that no such buyer will come forward, then they begin to remove the scalp from the victim's head. Then their two arms are tied to each of the two top beams of the square. Okay, and he describes the fire as a barbecue. Okay, and if one of the victims cries out, they see this as a weakness, and so rather than continue the torture, they take down the victim, give him something to eat to restore his strength, and then put him back up and begin the whole thing again. So it's rather detailed and a great drawing as well too. Okay. While LePage devotes many pages to the description of the alligator and rattlesnake, his photo is not nearly as impressive as Dumont's, a scene here from the library, from the Newbury, who describes the alligator but only mentions the rattlesnake in passing, anxious to get on to selling the New World. I quote from Dumont, and in fact, there are many more of these animals, alligators, in the remote lakes, for God, who governs all things, has removed them from the sight of men, as is true of other animals that are harmful to us, such as the rattlesnake. Yes, I must say, and will not be silent about it, that land is very good, the soil excellent, and the air not at all bad or unhealthy. So getting off the topic of rattlesnakes, even though he does mention that the rattlesnake gets a rattle for each year of it lives. At least it's probably true for most rattlesnakes in the US. Let's get back to our maps though. A little further upriver from the first plantation you already saw, you come to the capital, New Orleans. And here's the earliest map I could find, undated, at the library, but at the Newbury Library, and it was in the Air 257 collection. Okay, if you look at it closer, it does identify the church, the convent, number 2, the prison, number 3, La Place, okay, the plaza or the square, I mean Jackson Square, which is still there today. You've got the magasin or the warehouse off to the right here. The Place d'Armes is still there today, as well as the original street layout given here. Okay, notice the levee as well, and the area for inhabitants, 19. This is very similar to the map that I found in LePage, which was clearly out of date when he published his work in the mid-1700s. What's interesting, though, is that the town streets are already laid out in these first maps, while New Orleans follows this 18th century grid arrangement. The streets of the suburbs follow the boundaries originally set out in the long lot system that can be seen in this next slide. This is just a 1847 map from the Library of Congress, where you've got New Orleans here, you've got the grid clearly here, but these are the suburbs seem to follow that long lot system that is well known by the French. Here's another map of New Orleans, and here we see the actual street names: Rue de Chartres, Rue Royale, Rue de Bourbon, okay, that still exist today. It's from the Newbury's Count Marine collection, dated from 1744. Most of the places are in the same location as in the other maps, okay? But if you notice at the bottom, close to the river, there are some fairly large estates there and there, okay? But I believe it's one of these that belong to Dumont, okay? And here is Dumont's map, okay? It's the Dumont Logement de l'Auteur à la Nouvelle-Orléans. So the accommodations of Dumont, okay? The French manuscript and associated drawings and maps from the library are dated 1747, but we have a typical French establishment from around the 1730s here. Okay, we see the number 1 is the Maison Principale. Okay, then you've got number 2, the cuisine and slave quarters, along with a four, an oven over here. It's not as large as the first concession we saw. Then there's also a gap here in the enclosure that probably leads down to the Mississippi. The other opening, okay, leads to a trellis and a premier jardin and like a small garden over here, as well as des espèces d'étangs, okay, these little ponds. And then we proceed to the grand jardin. Although there's nothing mentioned in the key, okay, as to what is planted, early settlers like Dumont were probably experimenting with different types of plants and trees to see what would grow best in the Mississippi Delta environment. And here's my favorite of this one. Number 4 is the Saut servant de poulailler. So it's a willow tree serving as a hen house. And number 10 is the échelle par où les volailles montent à l'arbre pour aller se coucher. Okay, so the ladder that the poultry climb up to go to sleep. So it's a little more compact than the larger concession that we saw downriver, but this is more of a logement, but also noting the possibility that, hey, this is the new world. What grows best here? About 200 miles north of New Orleans, you come to Fort Rosalie, okay, and the Natchez settlement. Okay, here's a map of Dumont. Okay, it was built in 1716. It's a crude palisaded fort around which the French settlement developed. Eventually, it accommodated more than 1,000 farmers growing tobacco, wheat, and other crops. But the French were forced to flee after the 1729 Natchez uprising. Okay. Dumont shows this fort around that time. Fort Rosalie is in the center on a cliff, okay, above the Mississippi River. Around it are many rolling hills, great typography here. Okay. But notice that the French farms are all spread about and unprotected in the open countryside. There is a village sauvage up here. Okay. Note the circular enclosing here. Okay. Whereas the French one, this is the only French one. This is Terre Blanche in the upper right square, has the square palisade. In general, it appears that the French constructed square palisades while the Native Americans built round ones. However, the open, unprotected, dispersed nature of the French farm certainly made them vulnerable to the 1729 sudden attack. Both Lepage du Prat and Dumont de Montigny devote long sections of their accounts to describing the 1729 Natchez uprising that took the lives of almost 250 French colonists, destroyed Fort Rosalie, and seriously damaged the French prospects in the region. They were both in New Orleans at the time of the uprising. But their accounts are based on survivors. I will not go into any more detail on the actual Natchez uprising, but refer you to an interesting article written by Gordon Sayre, where he compares Lepage's and Dumont's accounts with Chateaubriand's epic or novella. And I quote from his article, Natchez, with rich cultural land and a bluff safely above the floods and miasmas of the bayous, became the focus of a speculative boom in France, leading to the Mississippi bubble of 1720 that made Law's name infamous. After the crash, the potential for settlement at Natchez remained, but then the events of 1729 burst that bubble too. Okay, so there seems to be some problems in the New World. Okay, our last map, okay, that we'll look at today is a more recent find described by Gordon Sayre, which can be found at the Library of Congress website. Okay, now it's not the most exciting map until you start looking at the details. Okay, it's the Carte de la Province et Colonie de la Louisiane. Okay, which gives the furthest places that the French live. It also notes the positions of the Native American Indians, and it also notes what each part of the territory can provide naturally, namely what type of food is available. And again, notice the word here when he mentioned ensemble de la position présente des différentes nations des naturels américains. Okay? As in LePage's published writings, the map title refers to the American Indians with the word naturel and not sauvage, as used by other French colonial writers. And although sauvage doesn't really carry the same connotation as English savages, the unusual word naturel does reflect LePage's sympathy for American Indian culture. LePage was not a military officer, but he was eager to boast his skills as an engineer. And at the bottom, we do read LePage Dupratz, ingénieur machiniste du roi, architecte pour le civil et pour l'hydraulique. This pretty much follows Dumont's map, but with less detail. Here, if we go, if we go just up here, okay, and look at this area here. Okay, number 12, we come across the Canal du Diable, okay, the channel of the devil, because there's rapids, okay, where it goes very fast, okay. Then we come across number 13, which is the Terre Blanche area, okay, so with the fine white earth and ochre, okay. And then we also have, we have number 14 is the actual, you actually have Fort Rosalie right here, okay. And the Natchez over here. So this corresponds to the map that we saw by Dumont. Okay, it's just a little. It just turned the other. It just turned the other way. Okay, and notice that he does mention that that the Nation des Natchez, okay, cut the throats and assassinated nearly 600 Frenchmen in 3 hours. So a gross exaggeration of that. One word that I have had a problem with is this word écove. It's des Blancs écove. It's and it gives it in parenthesis, écove est une montagne coupée par l'eau. Okay, il y a des terres très blanches et fines et de l'ocre. If anyone is familiar with this word, I really would appreciate your comments in the chat. Okay. But merci d'avance. Okay. So, les premiers en remontant sont les écoves blancs. Les écoves est une montagne coupée par l'eau. Les secondes sont les grands écoves où il y a des terres très blanches et fines et de l'ocre. Okay. Okay. Any event, to get back to my talk though, the page maps gives names of rivers but little typography, and no Sea of the West, no Mer de l'Ouest, as we saw in last night's presentation from Professor Massani. Okay. There's no diamonds, there's no crystals along the Arkansas River either. But the page does emphasize the natural wealth of the land. He notes the silver mines, the coal mines, the lead mines. He notes marble, red and white, as well as slate. He says that this land is full of cattle and all sorts of game. And the prairies are just absolutely covered with strawberries and mushrooms and mûri and medicinal plants. And to top it all off, you can get the best chestnuts in the world here. Okay, here we have chestnuts. There are chestnut trees, of which the chestnuts are more beautiful than those from Lyon. Okay, and here we have these hills and prairies are covered with vines, fruits, and game. Okay, so it's an unusual map in that you don't have all of the topography, but you just have you really just have all of the rivers on this particular map. Okay. All the different rivers and lots of writing about what's located in each of the areas. Okay, it's a very interesting find that's only been in the Library of Congress for the past 10 years. Okay. One of the most interesting chapters of LePage was one towards the end of book 1 on the reflections of what gives occasion to wars in Louisiana. And I'll quote here, in the space of 16 years that I resided in Louisiana, I remarked that the war and even the bare disputes we have had with the Indians of this colony never had any other origin but our too familiar intercourse with them. The French traffickers or traders are generally young people without experience, who in order to gain the goodwill of these people afford them lights or instruction prejudicial to our interest. This familiarity gives occasion to vices, whence dangerous distempers ensue, and corruption of blood, which is naturally highly pure in this colony. These persons who frequently resort to the Indians imagine themselves authorized to give a loose to their vices from the practice of these last, which is to give young women to their guests upon their arrival. Again, now you can really hear the 18th century-ness of the English translation of LePage du Pres. This resorting to the Indians puts these last under constraint as being fond of solitude, and the constraint is even more heightened if the French settlement is near them. And the fifth reason, commerce, which is the principal allurement that draws us to this new world, instead of flourishing, is on the contrary endangered by the too familiar resort to the Indians of North America. Thus, it would be for the interest of commerce if the Indians were left to come to fetch with merchandise they wanted, who, having none but us in their neighborhood, would come for it, without the French running any risk in their commerce, much less in their lives. The fort, so any French fort, would have to be at a distance. Would be a short journey distant, would be built without obstruction or giving any umbrage to the Indians. As they might be told, it was built in order to be a hand to truck their furs, and at the same time to give them no manner of uneasiness. As Serres states, control of Louisiana relied on a delicate détente with Indian nations, and such as the Natchez, and on extensive trade networks. I'll move on to a quick conclusion. Both Dumont de Montigny and LePage du Pres emerge as important colonial voices. They are easily obtainable. There are English translations that are readily available. In English, the Dumont maps in Serres 2012 edition, and you have LePage from the Library of Congress So these maps are also readily available online as well. Both explorers lived in Louisiana from the 1710s to the mid 1730s, about 20 years, but they wrote their accounts later in France. They both underscored the complexities of colonizing the French territory in the early 1700s. At times, it's difficult to remember where you read one account other than the 18th century English versus the 20th century translation of Serre of Dumont. Okay, but in essence, both authors were discussing their work in Paris, I'm sure, and also accusing each other of plagiarism and basically competing for authority over the same material. These two colonial explorers were in essence entrepreneurs attempting to capitalize on ideas and information by convincing those with capital or political favors to invest in their expertise, according to Serre. Their detailed descriptions and maps, just as the early maps of Quebec we saw at the beginning of today's presentation, sparked interest in the native inhabitants, the environment, and the opportunities for wealth. In essence, marketing the vast French territory seen in Delisle's map. Thank you for your attention.
Peter, thanks so much for a fascinating presentation. I'll give people a little bit of time to enter any questions into the chat. We have thanks to a couple of you who are going to help Peter out with his mystery word. It's not a cove, but a cur, meaning a bluff. It's an R, not a V, Peter. So join the ranks of those who have done their best to read 18th century French handwriting, sometimes with great frustration. I sympathize with you, but now that mystery is solved. It is a car, like a falaise, cliff. One question that it came up earlier, when you were talking about the, excuse me, I'm scrolling back into the chat. One question that was sent to me directly, the concession that you were talking about along the Fleuve Saint Louis, which I guess I'm assuming is the Mississippi in this case. Do we know the location of that concession? And has it been located? Has there been, is there any archaeological evidence of it that you know
of? I don't know. I'm not sure of the archaeological evidence, but it's in the Plaquemine parish. So it is it is no longer there. So that is a good question. I'm not sure about any archaeological sites there for the moment, but it did it existed, and I remember seeing it on the last hurricane that came into Louisiana. And I said, oh, that's exactly what I'm reading about is this particular Plaquemine parish. So it doesn't exist there now, but I'm not really sure if there's any kind of site. But that is a good question, though.
And Michael Nassani has written in the chat to me. He wonders if it was like. We discussed last night if it was washed away by the river, because we certainly know that the Mississippi has not been kind to as many French settlements on its
well, that's what I assumed, that especially the lower Mississippi, things disappear and just move along. But it is no longer there today, as far as I know. But and I don't know about any archaeological sites that are there as well. But
and thanks to Michael McCafferty, who suggested, Peter, if you look in the chat, there is someone at North Carolina who is authority on the archaeology of the Natchez and the lower Mississippi, who might be a good contact for you if you want to note that down.
Great! I will save that. Let's see.
Oh, good. Jot that down.
I've already saved the chat, so thanks for letting me know.
Great. Randa had a question. And I'll quote her, she said, I wonder if the last two authors, map makers, were thinking about competition with the northern French colonies as well in attracting colonists.
You know, they were thinking of a competition with the northern French colonies. I think they were already kind of I mean, they never mentioned the. I know that Dumont spent a year in Quebec before being commissioned to go to Louisiana, but I don't know if they were trying to compete with the northern French colonies. They kind of had enough to do on I mean, with themselves, just trying to figure out how to make the land in Louisiana cultivable. I mean, livable, as well as what they could grow there, and how to get along with the Native Americans. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you there, Randa, but.
That's fine. Sometimes these things don't show up in the text. I just wondered, as there were pictures of plants, that the agricultural, the plant and crops would be so different in the two climates, that maybe they were thinking they could attract people because it would be easier to grow crops in the South, but they may not have been thinking about that.
There is a whole discussion on beavers in LePage, and I mean, actually drawing the beaver dams and the beaver lodges. So, and they moved all the way up to the Illinois. I mean, at times for exploring purposes, but they seem to have spent most of their lives in the lower Mississippi and trying to make a living down south, more than going up further north, other than just for occasional exploration and to write about it.
Thanks, Peter. If we do not have any other questions, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat as we hit the 8 o'clock hour. I'd like to thank Peter once again for a fascinating talk and for taking time on a Tuesday evening to chat with us. And I will remind everybody, we will be back here again tomorrow night at 7 p.m. With Randa Duvik as our presenter, and then we'll take a short break and come back on Saturday with 2 more presentations, and I hope to see you there. So have a good evening. Bonne soirée à tout le monde. Good evening.
And thank you to Michael and Patrick for finding out my écœur, the bluffs. I really appreciate your help on this. Yes, exactly. Okay. À demain.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.